Hello everyone, today we talk about the German Ministeriales and their autonomy in the alienation of their own fiefs and Allods. As we have seen many times, the German Ministeriales were fundamentally this servile knightly class that started developing in Germany from, say, post-Carolingian times. Mostly we've seen it in their roots already in Ottonian times. It had an important development by the 11th to 12th century especially, and reaching essentially a quasi-equivalence, at least in terms of the de facto power owned with the free knights in Germany by the 13th. Eventually by the 14th the juridical divide ceased, because first of all, most of the institutions that the public institutions that had kept the distinction kind of collapsed. Germany privatized, and these knights were considered a bit all the same. As a matter of fact, they lived as ministeriales a crisis during the 14th century, economically wise. That's also why so many German mercenaries went abroad fighting, which was not the only reason, by the way. But that's another thing we will see perhaps better on another occasion. And so much, and this formula was so fortunate. Let's say, of having properly servile knights, that therefore you could simply use, purchase, exchange, whatever, that would not inherit, because whatever thing you entrusted to them, they didn't have the right of freemen to inherit it, right? And so it was extremely advantageous. The ministeriales were firstly, developed as such by the clergy. The term ministerialis in Latin is to be found, often in many contexts. Ministerialis is from Latin. It means adminis, the least important things, from which administrator comes from, and that was their function, right? Also in civil way, but as you understand, in such a privatized, militarized reality like the German one, these people were de facto administrators, and hence, some sort of vassals in practice. But that had, again, this advantage: you didn't have to make them inherit whatever fief you entrusted them, and they took, let's say, over numerically, right, by the 13th century, especially in southern Germany, given that they had nurtured, in particular by the Hohenstaufen, and so lands closer to the Alps, in Swabia in particular, etc. But not only, they had become, quite numerous. It's been estimated by the 13th century, 90% of the German knights in places like Swabia and Austria were de facto ministeriales, and they were the backbone, in fact, also of those armies. So we'll talk profusely about them, and we have started this series about medieval Germany that includes looking a bit more in detail at these individuals, because as you can expect, in spite of their juridical condition, their autonomies were quite similar in many ways to the one of other vassals, right? And it's interesting to see how they operated with their lords. In the case of them properly, or their lords, or both, wanting to sell, or alienate, or maybe donate, that this was, as we will see now, quite common, especially to ecclesiastical institutions, their fiefs, as the ones that were given by their lords, or properly the allods. So those properties that the same ministeriales had purchased on their own, given that they were starting being affluent, as you understand, properly and not differently from other vassals. And that still, however, because of the juridical condition of ministeriales, required a let's say the consent of the lords, and also some extra confirmation for the same, because that because of this, in fact, extra step, that theoretically the same institutions that received these gifts or purchased these fiefs or allods wanted to be sure that the ministeriales lords knew that they were selling this stuff, and so it was important for themselves too, because of course at some point maybe the lord was unaware of this, or opposed to it, or maybe there were some problems with the heirs, as we will see now. The same fiefs that were to be given, because the same ministeriales had some, eventually in their families, some expectations in this regard. And therefore the institutions would ask the lords whether everything was okay. There were formal renunciations of any kind of rights in these processes and so on. And the lords per se were not actually or necessarily hostile in principle to the alienation of the ministeriales fiefs or allods. Right, it was not a big deal. Vassals did it all the time. Ministeriales would do it all the time. It was a degree of autonomy that properly fit even the same function of the ministeriales in itself. These were people often provided with, castles, in fact, lands that were, in the very fragmented political situation in Germany, quite very often on their own. This was part of the reason also why this ministeriales as a generic administrator, even pre-Carolingian, post-Carolingian times, became so much, probably became a knight in medieval Germany, because it was this situation where of chronic political and institutional instability, for which you needed to have just armed and capably armed individuals in your possessions, wherever they were, how they were scattered in this. You can't really represent on a map what the very intricate forest of territories, of, let's say, of dependencies, of vassalatic, beneficiary, feudal relations were, and that's a very complicated thing. So having a knight there, and in these areas of Germany, you can imagine still, today we'll talk mostly about the 12th century, still in these, kind of rough countries. Maybe the ministeriales would live in a small tower in the middle of nowhere, but just for garrisoning some important passage points or something, was crucial, was important. And these men were growing in power, right, in prestige and capacity. And on the contrary, the same lords were often, actually inviting the ministeriales to make donations. For example, if they felt the need, to make one for their soul, to a monastery, etc., to do it in favor of the same lord's monastic foundations, were naturally, as most of Europe, private business in a way. So if your ministeriales wanted to sell something, to donate something to a monastery, why not doing it to one of their own lords? So maintaining actually the thing together, because at the end of the day, the ministeriales and the success of him was also in the opposite direction. That is, you would expect these men sometimes were really bought, purchased, that they could change, could be shifted together with all their families from a corner of Germany to another. Just that they couldn't say anything of that, because they were just serfs. But at the same time, they were, of course, this is obvious with their increasing degree of autonomization, but more in general, right? Their success depended also on the one of their lords. So it was important for their lord not to be a weak one, unless, of course, there would be some situation where the weakening of their lords would bring to some further degree of autonomization, maybe. But the fact that there were serfs still meant that the gap that existed with the freemen was such for actually, let's say, working on behalf of your own lord, so that your power, exactly as a serf, would be increased, and sometimes becoming even larger than one of a freeman, as we have seen, which would happen. Right, so it was a very complex thing, and that's why also, as we'll see now, all these security measures to ensure that donations, alienations in general, of fiefs and allods would go, the wanted way. And it was for the ministeriales a way also donating to one of their lord's monasteries, foundations, a way to reinforce their own, to show their loyalty, to prove their loyalty, which was an important value at the time. Ministeriales were particularly, in general, they were used by everybody, but they're politically wise in Germany, they were mostly from the royal and ecclesiastical side. This before the 13th century was particularly evident because they mostly fit the king's policy in Germany, and so they were so loyal to the kings because as serfs, knowing to depend on the king was actually quite prestigious and meant that in this attempt to stress to increase a public nature of German policy and capacity of concentration of power, ministeriales individually would be given that as serfs they couldn't aim at too much. They could still sensibly improve their condition as opposed to the free vassals, and instead were all about confirming their private prerogatives. And at the end of the day, as you know, the privates would win the struggle against the monarchy in Germany. So that's paradoxical also when the role of the ministeriales kind of was not needed anymore, but also because they had become so powerful they were just knights or lords like all others by that point, by the 13th century. The lords cared, of course, about getting compensated for alienated fiefs because those were their fiefs, right? And there were ways of doing that. So the lord would naturally retain on the ministeriales a control. Of course, with the fief, it's obvious because the fief is just like given by contract, but also on the allods, that is to say, on what the ministeriales had bought at his own expenses, and so in theory owning full property. But that's the full property of a serf, and therefore that depends on his master, right? So also on that, the lord would have something to say on the issue. So it was particularly important. Sometimes the lords would, for example, require a compensation for alienated fiefs by converting the ministeriales allods into fiefs, which meant that basically they, if a property was recognized as a fief, there was a much greater influence that the lord could exercise on that fief, whereas still the allod, in spite of being owned by a serf, still was considered something more personal. So this would be a form of compensation. The ministeriales sold a fief, and the lord would require part of the ministeriales property to become a fief in turn. And as we will see, mostly these things were regulated, were done consensually, right? The dynamics now in detail mirrored all certain patrimonial policies that we're not to explain now, but you understand how important such transactions were. And of course, the lords had, generally speaking, to express their right in order to give consent to alienation, and this was the point. The ministerialis is doing it, but does he have the full faculty for doing it? Well, he should require his lord's permission, and such permission was implied, especially when ministeriales could employ their lord's charters, seals, and witnesses to effect the actual transfer. Now, I think that sometimes this was done more autonomously than we think. Of course, every donation required often, as we'll see, at least if it was a particularly important one, so also the ones we have recorded show a specific lord's permission to that specific alienation. But sometimes I suspect that a lord could say, okay, you can use, I don't know, my seal if, for a certain degree of, or witnesses or charges, whatever, because the ministerials would presumably be even just a medium in the transactions themselves, would be a political agent at the same time. I'm not entirely sure, though I think seals especially or charters would be something much more directly connected to the personal involvement of the lord in any of these alienations. Let's say witnesses or the broader milieu and entourage of the lord would gravitate in part around this individual, at least for this kind of necessities. in 1140, Conrad III conferred his Ministeriales Baldwins, Allods, and Fiefs upon Weissenohe Abbey. So he was properly acting, let's say, for his Ministeriales. In 1166, Frederick Barbarossa did the same for Godfried of Erzhausen and Ortolf of Dierschhofen's gifts to Indersdorf and Biburg. And so that was an easy way, because the Lord would simply, okay, the Ministeriales would said, do you want to make this gifts to these monasteries? Okay, I will simply do it myself. Knowing that, of course, they will know that it's been you doing it, also because these foundations probably knew that the Ministeriales was at the head of such properties at the same, at an administrative level, in fact. But still, the donation could be reinforced by simply letting, in this case, properly the kings and emperors, actually in the case of Frederick Barbarossa by 1166, to do it for them, which was a prestigious way also to ensure properly the Ministeriales' will in that regard. And because we don't have to give for granted that these properties were even under a direct control of the lords, considering that they had been entrusted properly to the Ministeriales to be ruled on. So it's a bit just like the vassals, right? You give them this land, but in theory, yes, the land does belong as property of the senior, but this vassal is out there, is entrenched in the land, it's maybe far away, and so it doesn't matter how powerful the lord is, still that land may be temporarily out of properly of reach of the lord's retinues, because the Ministeriales technically is one of them, right? But it's doing it as a vassal who has the direct control, the practical and material one, on the property itself. So the simple expedient of requesting the lord to issue or authenticate the charters for gifts, sales, and exchanges was one of the safest, or if not the safest, in the first place. For example, Lothar III did this when Bevo of Gronau gave a substantial fief to Bursfeld in 1134. This arrangements, however, could become quite elaborate, quite complex, as, for example, in 1198, the Count Rudolf of Habsburg issued 4 charters effecting Werner and Kuno of Eilingen's gift of all their possessions to Kreuzlingen Abbey, including a letter explaining the Bishop of Constance that that Rudolf was confirming the donation and would allow no one to obstruct it. This is particularly important. So you have the Count of Habsburg that donates here. We are in Swabia, in Constance, basically in Switzerland, and so so the bishop had control properly on the ecclesiastical district with the Kreuzlingen Abbey stood, and so by letting on this complex donation, right, a gift of Werner and Kuno of Eilingen with 4 charters, right, the gift and giving their gift to in form of a possession to the Abbey of Kreuzlingen, the Count said that basically he agreed with that. There was nobody, given that these were his ministeriales and under him, that could oppose this decision. That in this sense, nobody also within, let's say, the same ministeriales families or connections could say anything against this donation, because of course, I don't know, if this is a donation to an abbey, maybe, I don't know, maybe some heirs of this ministeriales that want to say, but I wanted that, I didn't want possession to become of the abbey, right? And the first ones that we're interested in here is the Bishop of Constance, that is yet another powerful figure. So the Count of Habsburg, Bishop of Constance here would, in this sense, speak for respectively for their ministeriales and monasteries, to say, okay, we ensure each other that that's the deal, right? Nobody is to oppose this thing. It's consensual. We receive the permission of properly the owner at that point, and that's it. And nobody can oppose to this. And what is interesting about the same transaction is that some of the lands were transferred by Rudolf of Augsburg with Werner's assent, while some by Werner himself with the Count's authority, right? So this is particularly interesting because it even shows that the Count of Habsburg, so a free nobleman, even of some, at least locally of some importance, would still do this, would still, accept this transaction, showing that his own ministeriales, that is justice served, but let's say agrees with this. So attributing to his ministeriales still an importance, a prestige, a status of some sort. Because if Werner had said, wait a minute, I disagree with this, it's not much that, the ministeriales would have not made a great figure, and of course this would have created problems with the Count, but still it was important for Werner, that was in control of that land that he was gifted, that was being transferred by the Count, that he, as the ministerialist that was at the head of it, administratively speaking, agreed. So that this would ensure the Bishop of Constance that the ministerialist agreed with that as well, was doing it was agreeing with his master's will. And interestingly as well, is that there is a donation here. The former one, as we've seen, was formally effectuated by the Count, whereas another one of another part of land during the same transaction was done by Werner. So as ministerialis, as properly as an actor and as an agent, that in this transaction was operating with the Count's given authority, expressed authority. This is interesting because it shows also the different degree of, here I don't think we know the details of why these lands would be seen would require this different type of, why one would have to be given by the Count, one by the ministeriales formally, even though with each other's authority, consent. But it evidently shows a difference existing within these lands in terms, we don't know, of how connected the ministerialis probably was to that, and conversely how much the Count could have a grip or not on it, the value maybe of this land, or other things that we don't properly even know, even maybe about the communities that inhabited them, things that were political in nature, as you understand, and that we can't quite measure just per se. And in fact, it wouldn't be so rare, right? You see all the care that was, the caution that was used for these alienations, and it was not rare, in fact, that some gifts may be held up, or that they would stand in hazard or of invalidation if permission were not sought in due form. So these procedures were importantly formalized. For example, in the 40s of the 12th century still, there was an endangerment of a donation from the ministeriales Engelmar and Adelheid to St. Peter's at Salzburg, because this donation had taken place, quote, without the consent and permission of the ministeriales lord, and in that case was the Count Frederick of Peilstein. And everything was solved in that circumstance uh, by the intercession of the Archbishop Conrad with the Count. So in this case, you have a big archbishop that managed to intercede and to find an agreement where the ministeriales could essentially this ministeriales could give this land to this possession to him without having done it autonomously without the permission of the count. This is relevant now. I'm not aware of what the particular relation between the Count of Peilstein and the Archbishop of Salzburg, the latter being one of the major lords in the land, right? One of the most powerful ecclesiastical princes in Germany. And but it's still meaningful that the ministeriales would make this donation, being perfectly aware that their lord was not informed immediately, because it's not they just forgot all of a sudden that they were ministeriales and bound to a lord, but they considered their position to be such, maybe because of autonomy, etc., whatever, to simply do it autonomously. I don't know whether this was properly even a big deal for their count, but still, it took the Archbishop of Salzburg to solve the matter. And that was also quite of an authority to decide these matters. So that we find a very careful recording and repeated confirming as felt to be necessary to the long-term stability of the ministeriales gifts as well. Because the political situation may be more complicated. There is an interesting case of a Bavarian ministerialis, Raffold of Schönberg, giving allods, so even property that he owned personally, to the monastery of Reiten-Haslach, and the monastery petitioned both Conrad III and Frederick Barbarossa. I think at this point, because Frederick was already associated by his uncle to royalty, he would succeed him, to confirm the act. But this was not so. This was the highest, of course. These were the highest authorities in Germany, but not only, because it was also necessary to seek confirmation from Henry the Lion of the House of Welfen, who not just was another quite powerful and the second most powerful lord after the Swabians in Germany, but also because Henry was the lord of Raphael's nephew and heir of that Allod, the name of Berthold of Löwenstein. This is particularly meaningful. Here we see that, first of all, we should note here that the allods in question were in origin imperial gifts to Raphael's forebears. And so the situation we find here is quite interesting, because we have a ministerialis that is presumably here connected, I think, to the Swabians properly, not to the Welfen. So he's a public servant, you could say, and he had received this allod actually as an imperial gift, meaning that this was not a fief. The emperor had given to Raphael and his descendants as a gift, as a full property, as an allod property, this land, and therefore the ministerialis in theory could do whatever he wanted with that. Right, it was not like a fief that had properly still retain a through which he retain a connection on it with a lord. This was a property that in theory could be used in whatever way he was pleased, and when he wanted to give it here to the monastery of Reiten-Haslach freely, his own spontaneous. The monastery not only wanted to know from the royal authority, look, this was imperial stuff you gave to him, but can we get it? Yes, okay. But also, it happened that Raphael's nephew and heir of that same Allod, so of the property of his uncle, Berthold of Löwenstein, was not as a ministerialist depending on the Swabians, was depending on the Welfen, was depending on Henry the Lion. And as a consequence, the monastery said, wait a minute, if Raphael makes us this gift, are we sure that his nephew and heir will not harass us because he thinks that, that Allod actually belonged to him as an inheritance? And so they had to ask his lord, Henry the Lion, for consent, which was given, right? In fact, Berthold, who had actually expected to receive that Allod in inheritance, had to renounce to it, as the Duke Henry the Lion renounced, quote, whatever rights and authority we are seen to have in this matter, which was also, a relatively ambiguous matter, because that was imperial gift owned in Allod. But the fact that the monastery still would think that, given that the heir of this gift was still a man of Henry the Lion, so still belonging to the powerful clientele, asked to the same Henry to make it clear, at least that how things were to be. And Harry doesn't say, yes, we do it because we have any power on it. Technically, it was an imperial gift given in Allod property. So simply said, whatever rights and authority we are seen to have in this matter, right? So not any that we ever pretended to have, but still that we may be seen to have in this matter. No, we don't. So the gift was of course given, and so it's really important, especially for monastic beneficiaries that were not really, at least often, as powerful as the other princes of the empire, to say we're just monks, right? Even if sometimes monks could be quite powerful. If you think about the Abbey of Fulda, there you had some points seemingly in the 13th century, something like 20,000 armed men allegedly, but this was not the case. And so the question was, please, against the two most powerful family in Germany, please do not, make this thing safe, because we don't want to have any problem with either of you if somebody says anything. And by the way, it's also meaningful that the same Berthold of Löwenstein, as an heir of Raphael, would have such, say, autonomy and charisma to ask actually for that gift, even though it was perfectly legal for his uncle to donate a free property of the dirt in any way he wanted. And so even the fact that Henry had to step in to actually silence his own ministerialists is quite eloquent, even though nothing serious happened, about the fact that this ministerialist had some important power. And that was not just maybe because of the ministerialism himself, but because, again, he was one of Henry the Lion's ministerialists, right? And so the same ministerialist could feel like, I'm the guy of this, of the dukes of Saxony, etc. That we are powerful people, and instead, no, there didn't have to be a problem for this issue. And such fears that you can understand being normal in this context, fears of obstruction, explain, for example, why the Church of St. Mary in Aachen secured Conrad III's consent to a gift of Allod from one of its own ministeriales, because the ministerialis had purchased this gift of this Allod from a freeman, and the relatives of this man had claimed for some compensation. So you see the same thing. There would be freemen who had freely sold a possession to a ministerialis because he found it as a purchaser. He did it, and the relatives of this man said, "Wait a minute, we want actually some compensation." And it's interesting that this was done in the moment in which the ministerialis actually gifted this property to a church. St. Mary at Aachen was also, a relatively important church, which in turn had to ask the consent to Conrad III. So, and that was for this reason being harassed eventually by these relatives of the man who had initially sold this possession to the ministerialis, because they said I presume they reasoned as if they said that thing is still ours in a way or another, because yes, it's been sold to a ministerialis, but a ministerialis is just a serf, so we don't even, it's as if they hadn't considered the purchase as on equal grounds to let's say it's as if the possession of a freeman independently from what was kind of more important of the ministerialis will. This is an important one, because as a serf, his actions, his decision here to gift this a church with this possession was still seen with the idea that even though it was a free gift of a free man, was selling in Allod, this property to the ministerialis had somewhat made the property retaining a dependency on the freeman relatives, in heirs properly, so that a ministerialis couldn't quite do fully whatever he wanted with it. And if he wanted, however, to while recognizing that the purchase, the donation could happen, still it's as if the ministerialis had to remain bound to the original freeman owner and his heirs, so that they could get a compensation from this. And so this was not even, as far as I understand, and so this reveals still also the role of the king in these affairs, so that he had to make order and justice wherever there's instances occurred, which is fascinating because it shows actually kind of a contempt existing from the freemen towards the ministerialis as serfs, right? Never forget these ferocious hatred that existed properly in the form, and especially in countries like Germany that were kind of closer to the older idea of, properly of the, let's say, of properly what it meant to be a freeman as opposed to a serf, right? In a deep sense. Also considering that in Germany, the majority of people were really serfs, so those who were really freemen were quite, quite proud of that. Let's say Germany characteristically was about lords and all the rest of the people essentially being their own people, right? So as not as fully freemen in a way or another. So the ministerialis as a political pawn of public authority that very often was also dispossessing the freemen, at least in their autonomistic private ambitions. So the ministerialis as the agents of that political faction, and didn't like them at all, also because the ministerialis were factually men of war, and as such also quite very often quite violent and dangerous, and men that you didn't want to mess up with in general. And so they saw the whole situation as always as some sort of abuse, like we want this ministerialis to be on equal ground, to receive, to purchase, right? These people are serfs. It should be their lords that decide this thing. And so you also understand that probably most of the times all these like especially for the Allods, probably the Ministeriales didn't even have to ask much recognition from their lords. But somebody could step in the way and say, wait a minute, no. And so at that point, the lord would have to step in, or the king often. So, like in this case, this Ministerialis was probably not just a nobody in probably even in factual power for the king to intervene, also for the church, for a church in the first place, of course, to in Aachen especially to appeal themselves to the king. But let's say these were matters that evidently show the inherent tension in the German world between these various forces. And yeah, so we will keep talking about these topics. I found them particularly interesting because it also tells you, like, aside from the military nature of the Ministeriales, how much these men were, like even as men of war, were involved in, of course, in any other political and social situation, right? And also often meeting with some obstacles and difficulties and need of securing and power, also showing often their autonomy, their power, their factual power. There was something that risked to escape the control from the one of their own lords in the first place. So this is quite relevant in general, and we will keep looking at it. So for now, however, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.